trouble began at Stovepipe Bertha's. Bertha had a brothel on Yatkiver Street. It was a well-established spot, a business truly to envy. Because of Tamara, the place was always packed. Vilna guys couldn't get enough of her. On Friday evenings, Tamara didn't have a free moment. But Bertha was greedy. She wanted to grab a hold of the entire world. She started screaming at Tamara, turning her days into a living hell. First, she accused Tamara of talking too much, then of laughing when she shouldn't, and ignoring customers.
Tamara would have swallowed these insults because, after all, Bertha's brothel was warm and cozy. But one Friday evening, Bertha did something that was too much to bear. So Tamara waited until after Shabbos, and the next morning, first thing, she took her little trunk, packed her few dresses, and all the installments of the novel Regina the Spy that she bought every Friday, and left Bertha's.
The other girls in the trade told Tamara not to leave. After all, they'd all swallowed plenty of insults from the madams.
It's true. Tamara wasn't one of the great ladies of Vilna. She didn't have a dacha in Volokumpie, the beautiful area just outside Vilna, or spend her days in the Grienerstahl Cafe. But still, she had her self-respect. So why did Tamara leave Bertha's? Here's the story.
Every Friday evening, all of Tamara's regular suitors came to see her. There was Itzik the hare, One-Eyed Zorechke, Sender the stutterer from Yiddish Street, Mendel the fireman, and plenty of others. They all sat on a bench in the foyer waiting their turn. They'd prepared for Shabbos and were washed, clean-shaven, and wore clean shirts. Herschela the porter, a dwarf whose feet didn't reach the floor, stood out from the others. Tamara caressed him differently from the others. He didn't grab her like she was the kugel in the cholent, or insult her with vulgar language. He had beautiful manners, and even brought her a little bag of candy every so often. Women tore each other to pieces over men like Herschela. With his virility, he really needed to stay the entire night, but he could barely afford one visit. Afterward, he lay with Tamara, his short legs stretched out to her ankles, and asked, "Tamarinki, let me lie next to you for another moment. I want to feel like a married man."
Tamara didn't say a word. She took advantage of Herschel's fantasy to catch her breath. With a glass of cold tea she'd prepared earlier, but not had time all evening to drink.
Meanwhile, Bertha noticed several guys get up from the bench preparing to leave. She heard Sender the stutterer suggest they pay a visit to Four-Eyed Esther's brothel on Zavalna Street next to the lumber market. Sender stuttered, "Why should we sit here like hens on our eggs?" And so, while Herschela was lying next to Tamara, luxuriating in the moment, Stovepipe Bertha began banging her fist on Tamara's cubicle door and screaming, "Herschela, may you burn you know where! Guys like you shouldn't come Friday night. Come during the week. You're ruining my business."
Tamara dragged her little trunk to her friend Black Lake's rented room on Skaplerna Street behind the railway station. As she made her way to Lake's, Tamara's entire being raged against Bertha. That woman has completely forgotten that a girl from the trade is also a person with a heart and feelings like they sing in the Yiddish theater. I'm not just putting holes in matzah where the oven's burning hot. You have to shove the merchandise in as quick as possible. And who did that gangster Bertha pick on? Little Herschela, the loneliest guy in Vilna. He doesn't have a single soul to cuddle him. At Lake's, Tamara had time to open a book. She was better educated than any of the other women in the trade. She even exchanged books at the Mefitze Haskola Library on Zavalna Street, where she depended on Krasny, the librarian, to tell her what to read. He recommended a book called The Lady of the Camellias by a certain Duma. Tamara read the story to her friend, Black Lake. They both had a good cry, especially at the end when the lady, who was no lady at all, but ate the same bitter fruit as they did, earned from lying in strangers' beds, went to her death.
When Siomke Kagan, the reporter for the Vilner Tog newspaper, had tried to establish a professional union for Vilna streetwalkers, Tamara was the first to speak up. She'd raised the issue of overtime, which the brothel owners, the pimps, refused to recognize. Like many of Siomka's projects, nothing came of the professional union. But from that day on, Tamara used strange words like
Exploitation, class consciousness,
and
general strike. Tamara left the profession and lived with Leica on Shkaplerna, pretty far from the center of the city. Leica supported herself from the occasional guests she brought home, elderly Jews who weren't from Vilna. She was able to offer her friend a bowl of soup and a glass of tea. Tamara felt badly about leaning on Leica, so she looked for a way to earn a groschen, but her efforts didn't lead to much. Stovepipe Berta wanted to take her back, but Tamara had her self-respect. Tamara still saw Herschel the porter, who stopped by Leica's every so often, but she got more love than money from Herschel.
Siomke Kagan really wanted to help Tamara. He saw her as a victim of the brutal capitalist system which he had fought so bitterly throughout his youth. He tried, once again, to open a school for love in Vilna and wrote a long article in the newspaper about the project, underlining its importance and the honor that such a school, the first in the world, would bring to Vilna. He pointed out that to add to the bargain, Vilna had two highly qualified educators, Tamara Shimeliski and Leah Brenner, known in professional circles as Tall Tamara and Black Leke. That's how Siomke Kagan introduced his readers to Tamara and Leke.
Tamara didn't put any stock in Siomke's plan. It had been tried once before. They'd even ordered a sign, Public School for Love, but nothing had come of that plan.
Siomke didn't give up on the idea and searched the city for teaching material. He rummaged in Funk's, the small bookshop on Deitche Street, until it dawned on him that Heikel Lunsky, the librarian at the Strashun Library, would be able to help him. So Siomke went to the library to see what Heikel could do for him. Heikel Lunsky walked to an out-of-the-way cupboard and took out a pamphlet that precisely spelled out the rules for having sex with a woman, as well as what to do to pleasure a man. He stroked the pamphlet, reprinted from a manuscript that had to be a good few hundred years old. The author's name wasn't given. The pamphlet, written in Hebrew, was called Ahave Beta'anugim, which in plain Yiddish means pleasure in love. Siomke asked Lunsky to translate the pamphlet into Yiddish, but Lunsky dismissed the suggestion. Smiling into his thick beard, he murmured, Siomke, our sages have already given us the knowledge you're thinking about bringing to Vilna. You won't discover America with this. It'll stir up the entire world. A school for love in Vilna using pedagogic material from original Jewish sources, literally from rabbinic literature. Heikel Lunsky patiently heard Siomke out. Then he put the pamphlet back in the cupboard with the other rare religious books.
Tamara wasn't counting on Syomke and his fantasies, so she searched around for a way to earn a living. She'd already tried standing in the market with a basket of chicken giblets. The market women sent her away, claiming there were already too many women selling their wares. Tamara went to work in the chicken shed, plucking poultry. There, the women readily accepted her. Before long, she brought Black Lake to work. The two women sat with their legs buried in mountains of chicken and goose feathers, reminiscing about the old days when they had earned more from one client than from 10 plucked chickens. Lake's boy, Alinka, ran around the chicken shed, making all the pluckers happy. Alinka was the product of a casual encounter with some unknown Jew, but Lake insisted that the father was Elijah the prophet.
Syomke did do one thing for Tamara. He got her involved in a group that met secretly in a garret in Ramaila's courtyard on Yiddish Street. A pair of trouser stitchers, several journeyman tailors, a few seamstresses, and a glove maker sat together for hours in the evenings. A young man with hungry eyes praised life in the great Soviet Union under the sun of the Stalinist constitution, a life to envy. Everyone in the group knew about Tamara's former life. The skinny young man presented her as a former slave of the bourgeois order.
Tall Tamara plucked chickens, attended the group from time to time, and tried to be happy with her life. But it wasn't easy. Sometimes she felt the urge to slip on a low-cut blouse and her skirt with the deep slit that showed off her long legs, take her patent leather bag in hand, and stand on Savitch Street beside the Piccadilly cinema, winking at passers-by. But what if someone from the group happened to walk by? What would they say? In the garret on Yiddish Street, they treated her like she'd never worked for Stovepipe Bechtel. Tamara made do with the chicken shed and taking books from the library. Once, Krasny, the librarian, hurriedly handed Tamara a book of stories called Folk Tales by someone named Peretz. Tamara wanted to ask for something else right away, a novel, a story with love and duels. But it was Friday and readers were rushing around and pushing and shoving to get a book for Shabbos. So Tamara put the folk tales into her basket and went to Lake's on Staplerna.
That evening, the two friends sat at the table without saying a word, like a pair of discharged soldiers. Alinka was already asleep. The candles, which Leka had started lighting every Shabbos after Alinka, her Kaddish, was born, flickered on the chest of drawers. It was autumn. The light rain tapped on the low window looking out on a small garden in the style of the wooden houses in the neighborhood. Tamara leafed through the folk tales, her full lips frowning uncertainly, while Leke silently collected the challah crumbs from the Shabbos tablecloth. She resented Tamara, who'd been so absorbed in her book that she hadn't said a word all evening. Finally, Leke couldn't stand it any longer. "Tell me what's so interesting," she grumbled.
These stories are hard to understand. There are a lot of Hebrew words. You have to be a rabbi to figure them out.
So why knock yourself out? On Sunday you can ask for a book you won't have to kill yourself to read.
No, there is one story I did understand. It's very, very, well, about...
So tell me, about this, about that, about what?
It has deep thought.
What's the thought?
I have to read it to you.
Just tell me what it's about.
It's It's a story about three gifts. A Jew dies, but he isn't allowed into paradise until he brings three gifts to heaven.
What, they need gifts in heaven?
If you ask stupid questions, you won't get to hear the story. A writer wrote it. Just listen.
What's the problem? I can't even ask a question.
He brought a pin to heaven as a gift.
Leica was afraid to ask why they'd need a pin in heaven, so she kept quiet.
The dead Jew brought two more gifts, a little sack of earth from Israel and a yarmulke. The story about the pin really touched me. So here's what happened. The priests condemned the rabbi's daughter to death because she was out on the street when a church procession passed by. Years ago, Jews weren't allowed to be on the streets where Goyim lived. To punish the rabbi's daughter, they tied her braid to the tail of a wild horse so the beast could drag her through the cobblestone streets. When the priest asked the rabbi's daughter for her last wish, she wanted a pin. He pinned her dress to the flesh of her legs. And that way, her dress wouldn't lift up in the wind and people wouldn't see her female parts when the horse charged through the streets.
To her very flesh?
Just like you heard it.
She was going to her death. Didn't she have other things to worry about? At that point, what difference did it make?
That's exactly the point. She went to her death as a rabbi's daughter, not a shameless woman.
Leica shrugged and frowned, convinced that the rabbi's daughter in Peretz's story had done the right thing.
The two friends, who regularly removed their clothes for strange men, went to bed, each drawing her own conclusion about the story. Tamara stayed in the chicken shed, surrounded by feathers, until the war broke out. The Germans and Russians divided up Poland. On the 19th of September, 1939, on a beautiful morning at the beginning of autumn, tanks with red five-pointed stars on their sides appeared on the streets of Vilna. Tamara shook down feathers from her apron and ran along with everyone else to see the miracle. The entire group from the garret in Ramaila's courtyard on Yiddish Street danced around the tanks like close relatives at a long-anticipated wedding. But the party didn't last long, in total 6 weeks. Then the Russians gave the city to the Lithuanians as a gift. The Russian tanks, looking like well-fed turtles, snuck out of Vilna in the middle of the night. The klumpers, as the Lithuanians were called in Vilna, enjoyed the gift for 8 months until the Soviets decided to return and free them from the problems of running their own state. This took place on the 15th of June, 1940.
That's when the members of the group that met in Ramaila's courtyard really came to life. Shaike Eicher, who lost an arm in the Spanish Civil War, became the director of the city buses. Lam, a men's hat cleaner, was appointed manager of a movie theater. Breike, the trouser tailor, took over Berger's soda water plant. Vilna was drenched in the odor of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Everyone said that Tamara had had leftist sympathies from way back. The new regime installed her in a meat cooperative warehouse. Black Leica did better than anyone else. He ensnared a lieutenant from the Red Army, a fine shagitz, not a big drinker. He immediately bought her a white shawl, the type worn by the lieutenant's wives, and even went to live with her on Skaplerna Street. The shawl lay on Leica's locks like snow on a hill of smoldering coals. It was a pleasure to look at her. Leica fit right in with the other garrison wives. She quickly picked up bits of Russian, enough to explain to her cronies the difference between a long nightgown and a formal gown. The ladies who'd just arrived in Vilna were sure you could go dancing in the officers' club in a nightgown. With the lieutenant, Leka became more refined and took on style. Vilna didn't recognize her.
Tamara was seen with various officers, but nothing stuck. She found herself a tiny room on Shavelska Street so she wouldn't interfere with her friend's good fortune.
It really was good fortune. Thanks to the lieutenant, Leka and her son were saved. During the Soviet retreat from Vilna in 1941, the lieutenant placed them on a military truck that took them deep into the hinterland. Leka wanted to take Tamara with them, but because of the urgency of the situation and the general turmoil, it didn't happen. The lieutenant cursed in the name of his mother, screaming that the German troops could show up at any moment.
And tall Tamara? She didn't have to suffer under the Germans for long. On Wednesday, the 17th of September, 1941, only 10 days after the Jews of Vilna were driven into the ghetto, Tamara stood with almost 1,300 Jews on the field at Ponar, the place not far from the city where the Germans murdered the Vilna Jews. Tamara had had her own special luck. They didn't drive her into the ghetto. She was already there. Shavelska Street lay in the heart of the ghetto. During the first few months of the brutal German rule of Vilna, Tamara tried her hand at various things. She sold chicken giblets and got what she could from Herschel the porter, until she fell as if into a whirlpool between the evil decrees stipulating that to stay alive, she needed a certificate from the Germans called a Schein, allowing her to work and stay alive. Tamara stood with the other women on the field at Ponar, gazing into the distance. Who could she have been thinking of? She was absolutely alone. She had no one. She'd been abandoned as a child and raised in an orphanage. She'd earned her living as a waitress for Zuska, the professor, in his bar on Konska Street, until he told her that with her legs, she could make more money standing on a street corner. The order was given to undress. Tamara did not undress. She dug her fingernails into the soft flesh of her plump arms without giving any indication that she would undo even a button. Tamara refused to obey the German who stood opposite her with a machine gun. She was taller than him. Standing in her cotton dress with its red and blue flowers, she looked him straight in the eye without reacting to his shouting. He didn't shout for long. A moment later, Tamara lay in the sand, felled by a hail of bullets.
That's how tall Tamara, the last Jewish streetwalker in Vilna, met her death. A woman who was wounded and managed to crawl out of the pit at Ponar during the night and return to the ghetto told us what had happened.
Sag nit kein Mal, als du gehst im letzten Weg. Chot schimmeln Bleine, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abheugt und unser Trott mir seinen Do. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abheugt und unser Trott mir seinen Do. Von grünem Palmenlein bis weißem Lein von Schnee. Wir kommen an mit unser Pein, mit unser Weh. Und wo gefallen ist der Spritz von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Quote, unser Mut. Und wo gefallen ist der Spritz von unser Blut. Sprotzen wird dort unser Quote, unser Mut. Es fett die Morgensen begelten uns dem Heind. Und der Nächten wird verschwinden mit dem Feind. Nur ob versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie ein Paro, so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Nur ob versammeln wird die Sonne in dem Kajor. Wie ein Paro, so gehen das Lied von Dor zu Dor. Sag nicht kein Mal, als du gehst im letzten Weg. Chotschimlen bleiene, verstellen bläue Tag. Kommen wird noch unser ausgebänkte Show. Es wird abheugt an unser Trott mir seinen Do.